After the Athenians were defeated at Syracuse in 413 BC, the outcome of the Peloponnesian War was ensured. Athens failed to rule the Greek peninsula, and over time a new power would develop to do what the world's first democracy could not. In 338 BC, Philip of Macedon conquered and unified Greece, but was assassinated before he could do more. His son, Alexander, came to the throne in his place, and would go on to conquer much of the known world, changing the culture of those regions, as well as the rest of the world forever. One great empire, however, stood in his way. Persia had menaced Greece in centuries past, but had begun to decline. Still, the empire controlled a massive area from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan, and was not going to go down easily. The final clash between these two empires, one rising and one falling, would take place in what is now Iraq at the Battle of Gaugamela. Gaugamela was the third battle in a sequence of important battles in the ancient world. In the book The 15 Decisive Battles of the World, written in 1851 by Sir Edward Shepherd Creasy, the Battle of Gaugamela, also known as the Battle of Arbela, takes the third position chronologically. In the previous entries, which I have videos for on my channel, the Battle of Marathon spared Greece and Western society from becoming Persian, and the Battle of Syracuse ensured that Rome and Macedon would go on to become powerful factors in Western development. This entry, however, is different. While Marathon and Syracuse saved Western culture, Gaugamela ensured its spread. In this video, I'm going to look at the Battle of Gaugamela in depth, from the leaders and historical context of the time, the weapons and armies of the opposing sides, the events of the battle itself, and the influence the battle would have in the short and long terms of history. But before we get into the battle itself, we have to understand what was happening in the world at the time. Also remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you like these videos. It helps you know when I upload, since YouTube's algorithm isn't so kind to videos looking at war or military history. And it helps me by growing the channel. Alright, back to the video.
Little vassal, you bitch, let me spell out the list. I brought foes to their knees in Phoenicia, breezed through Gaza to Giza, had the Balkans, Persia, Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan in my expansion pack, while you died in the middle of a game of chess.
Greece in the 4th century BC was not all one unified country like it is today, but instead was inhabited by multiple city-states. These city-states had much in common, namely in language and religion, but they often fought between each other. In the late 5th century BC, a massive war broke out between various Greek nations known as the Peloponnesian War. Eventually, Athens, which had slowly begun turning into a regional superpower, was defeated, and Greece remained a multipolar peninsula. Various states, including Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, periodically went to war, but eventually one city-state would unify them all. That city-state was Macedon, located to the north of the others. Under Philip II of Macedon, Greece was unified into one entity in 338 BC. Philip hoped to unify the rest of the Greek world as well, which didn't just exist in Greece proper, but also across much of the eastern Mediterranean. However, Philip never actually achieved this, since he was assassinated in 336 BC. Replacing him was his son Alexander, only 20 years old. Alexander spent the first couple years of his reign consolidating power, killing opponents, and solidifying his northern Balkan borders. In 334 BC, he ventured out of Greece to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, with an army of about 40,000 men. With Alexander's crossing of the Dardanelles Strait, he would go on a tear of military victories for a decade, never to return to his native land, but instead conquering large parts of 2 other continents. Alexander quickly squared off against Persian forces in Anatolia at the Battle of Gaugamela, defeating them and taking most of the landmass. He spent the next year organizing the region, which was not difficult given that he opted to rule in a hands-off manner and allowed most everything to remain as it was under the Persians. In 332, Alexander faced Persian forces again, this time commanded by their king Darius III at Issus. This Darius was a descendant of Darius the Great, who menaced the Greeks during the Greco-Persian War. While not born for the throne, Darius had proven himself in combat and had risen through the ranks, first as the satrap of Armenia, spanning from modern eastern Turkey through to northern Iran and Azerbaijan, then later as the head of the courier service, which facilitated the ability of Persia to reign over such a large area. After the assassination of his predecessors, Artaxerxes III and IV, Darius came to rule Persia and assumed the name of his great ancestor. The mountainous seaside location of Issus, however, proved helpful for Alexander and detrimental to Darius, as the land was too hectic for use of chariots or massive forces. Once again, Alexander was victorious and the Persian king retreated. From here, Alexander moved south down the Levant, taking Damascus, Tyre, and Gaza before conquering Egypt, liberating it from Persia, and becoming pharaoh. Already, the Macedonian had earned his title of Alexander the Great. In just 2 years, he had conquered more than any Greek before him, but most of his conquest had yet to transpire. However, the critical year of his conquest would come in 331 BC, where he would have to face off against Darius and his massive Persian Empire for round 3, this time in more lopsided conditions. At Granichus, the Persian generals were sloppy and did not expect Alexander to be the military genius that he was. The next year at Issus, the Persians found themselves in bad terrain for a massive army. This time, however, Darius was prepared to crush his much smaller foe. Seeing the prowess of Alexander, Darius attempted to negotiate with him, going as far as to offer him lands west of Mesopotamia and one of his daughters in exchange for a halt to his conquest. Alexander, however, did not agree and aimed to attack Darius and take Persia for himself. In 331 BC, he marched from Egypt through the Levant up to northern Mesopotamia. Here, Alexander was farther from home than any Greek had gone, and he was playing into Darius's hands. If Alexander crossed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, he would have no chance of escape in the event of even a minor defeat on the battlefield, since the Persian forces would easily catch him as he tried to recross the rivers. To the north lay mountains, and to the south desert, meaning that Alexander had to win to survive. As Alexander moved to cross the Euphrates River, Persian forces from Babylonia saw him and tried to tempt him to the Persian army. Destroying their own villages as they moved, the Persian forces used scorched earth tactics and made it difficult for Alexander's forces to sustain themselves in the foreign land, making them even more desperate. Once the Greeks crossed the Tigris, Alexander had to make a choice. He could move south along the river towards Babylon, which would be a very risky move as many armies before him had tried the same maneuver and had been decimated by the desert and harassing forces. Or he could seek out Darius's much larger army and face him, leaving Babylon open for whoever won the battle. At first not knowing where Darius was, Alexander moved south, but after capturing Persian scouts, he learned that the Persians were not far away, near the village of Gaugamela, and about 20 miles from the city of Arbela. Finally, Alexander had a lead, and set up camp for 4 days, giving his men rest before the battle. This actually was all in accordance with Darius's plan, as he had picked a specific area for the battle that would make his massive forces optimally effective against Alexander's comparatively small force. Learning from his loss at Issus, Darius had chosen a wide open area for combat that would allow his massive force to be most effective. Additionally, if Darius did end up losing, he could retreat to the Bactrian lands, which he hailed from and knew well, and would be better suited to stay in power and reform an army there. During this time, however, a lunar eclipse happened. While today this may seem inconsequential, in ancient times this served as a bad omen, especially for the Persians. Seeing the moon turn blood red before going dark, the Persian and Babylonian priests concluded that the coming battle would be the end for Darius. The westward wind signaled that the threat would come from the west, and the outcome was all but certain for much of the Persian high command. Meanwhile, Alexander left all of his supplies and his wounded troops behind, along with a small detachment of men at the camp, and took all of his fighting men the short distance to some hills between the two camps. Spying suspicious engineering projects on the field below, the Greeks waited a day to scout and deliberate before battle. On the night of September 30th, one of Alexander's generals suggested a surprise attack at night on the Persians. Alexander, however, refused, wanting to win the battle fairly. This was not only for personal glory, but also to fully discredit Darius to his empire. If he won at night, Darius could claim that he was surprised and not able to mount a defense, but a defeat during the day would squarely peg Darius as the loser, which would dramatically harm his prestige. Creasy also makes the point that many of these Asiatic societies at the time often honored who was better in combat. Therefore, it would also make Alexander more likely to rule effectively over the Persian Empire rather than if he had attacked him at night. However, the Persians fully expected an attack at night, and Darius had his men stand at the ready all night long. This attack, of course, never came, and when the sun rose on August 1st, 331 BC, the Persians were sleep-deprived and tired, not ready for the impending battle. Alexander, on the other hand, slept in late along with his men, ensuring that they were well rested and ready to fight. Alexander then descended into the field, ready to fight for control of the world.
Winning every single war that I fought, so this'll be straightforward. I'll take up this sword that I brought and slice you in half like the Gordian knot, and I'll soar to the top like the eagle who's feathered.
The army of Darius was massive and consisted of many different fighters from across the Persian Empire. Soldiers from Bactria, Babylon, Armenia, India, Albania, Parthia, and even Greece made up Darius's army. These different fighters often had different weapons, different uniforms, and even different animals, but they fought under one banner and within the strategy of the Persians. I'm not going to cover all the different types of weapons and armor that Darius's army had, but I will cover the basic strategy and the Persian gear, which would be similar to the rest of the fighters. The basic Persian infantry was made up of two parts: shield bearers, known as sparabara, and archers. Sparabara were the front of the Persian lines and had large wicker shields about 6 feet tall and rectangular, known as spara. The sparabara lined up and formed a shield wall and fought with a short spear about 6 feet long with a silver orb at the base. This orb served as a counterbalance, a weapon, and a signifier of rank. The lines behind the sparabara were archers armed with recurve bows. These lines of archers would fire a rain of arrows down on advancing enemies and were the main damage dealers of the army. When it came to close combat, most Persians had very little training, and this was reflected in their equipment. Both archers and sparabara only had light armor, usually made of linen that covered their bodies, and sometimes helmets as well. For close quarters weapons, the primary sword was the Aakash. The Aakash had a short, double-edged iron blade between 14 and 18 inches long. Some Persians carried the sagaris instead. The sagaris was a single-handed axe, usually with a spike opposite the axe head. However, these were last-ditch weapons, as the sparabara usually did most of the close combat in a defensive capacity, while the archers did the real damage. The heavy infantry of the Persian army were the Persian Immortals. The Immortals made up the personal guard of the emperor and had much better training, gear, and status than the other soldiers. For armor, the Immortals are believed to have worn bronze scale armor, especially on their chests, and their spear butts were of gold rather than silver. The Immortals also had a smaller, more circular shield with cutouts on either side, so that they were more maneuverable and effective at melee fighting. The reason they gained the name Immortals is that they seemed to never die. The Immortal unit was made up of 10,000 men, known as a Hyvi Baram, and whenever one of them was killed, they would be replaced by the next battle, so that the unit was always at 10,000 men, and the fighters appeared to be immortal to enemies. Coupled with this was the Persian cavalry, armed with bows and longer spears. Some Immortals also fought on horseback, and these soldiers had armor on their horse as well as themselves. Some Persian cavalry units even used camels instead of horses. While they weren't as fast, camels scare horses and would cause disarray against enemy cavalry units. To supplement this, the Persians also had war chariots and war elephants. War chariots were drawn by 2 horses and were piloted by a reinsman as well as 1 or 2 fighters armed with bows, throwing javelins, and spears. Protruding from the ends of the axle of the chariots were scythe blades around 3 feet long. These blades were meant to decimate infantry units and were most effective when the chariots barreled through enemy formations. The war elephants were also a powerful tool in the Persian army. The elephants used by Persia were from India and were not as large as their African counterparts, only about 10 feet tall. However, they were extremely powerful psychological weapons, as most men had never seen one before and most armies had no good tactics for fighting them. Greek armies had never encountered elephants before this battle. However, while present, the beasts were not used to any real effect at Gaugamela. The elephant would be driven by a driver on the elephant's neck, and archers would fire at enemies from a leader mounted on the elephant's back. Elephants could be dangerous, however, for if the driver died or if the elephant was wounded too much, it could be uncontrollable and would trample both enemies and allies alike. Tactically, the archers and cavalry worked in tandem. When an enemy formation advanced, the Persian archers fired en masse at them, thinning their ranks. Ideally, the enemy forces would scatter, which would make them easy targets for cavalry. If the enemy regrouped to defend from the cavalry, they would once again be easy targets for the archers. This tactic did not work as well against the Greeks, however, given that they were very disciplined and had good armor that could protect against arrows. Chariots and elephants both served to scare and scatter enemy formations as well. At Gaugamela, the number of regular infantry is unknown for Darius, but estimates range between 50 and 120,000 men. Additionally, the Persians had 40,000 cavalry, 200 scythed chariots, and 15 war elephants. Alexander, by contrast, had a much smaller force and focused on quality over quantity. As I talked about in my marathon video, the Greek soldiers were more heavily armored than the Persians and specialized in close combat rather than ranged weaponry. While this was still true for Alexander, the army was not quite the same as it used to be. For one, the Phalangites, the Macedonian name for hoplites, had less armor. Substituting the bronze cuirass used in earlier times, Alexander's army wore linothoraxes made out of linen. These chest pieces were lighter and more maneuverable, but provided less protection. This theme of less protection existed with helmets as well. The Corinthian helmet of old was largely replaced by a helmet in the Phrygian style, with an odd-shaped lobe on the head, but with some protection for the cheeks. Additionally, the shield was smaller and flatter, about 24 inches in diameter and weighing only 12 pounds, much smaller than the aspis. Bronze greaves also protected the shins of the soldiers. All of this reduction in protection was facilitated, however, by the sarissa pike. The sarissa kept the general shape of the dory spear, with an iron head and a bronze spike on the other end to plant in the ground or counterbalance, but it was much longer than the dory. While the dory spear was between 7 and 10 feet long, the sarissa was between 15 and 20 feet long. This meant the Macedonians had more distance between them and their enemies, but it also meant that the pike had to be used with 2 hands. To provide protection, the shield was strapped either around the left arm or the shoulder or neck of the spearman rather than being held. The spike on the other end of the sarissa was used not only to counterbalance but also to plant into the ground. This tip was bronze rather than iron to avoid rusting as well, as it would get dirtier. Some metal near the lower end of the spear also existed for reinforcement as well as keeping the balance towards the back. For close quarter combat, the Macedonians had short swords, either the xiphos, a leaf-shaped double-edged sword, or the machaira, a single-bladed sword similar to a kopis. The Phalangites fought in a phalanx formation with a shield wall and bristling spears facing the enemy. With the added length of the sarissa, 5 whole ranks of spears would protrude through the shield wall, with the remaining ranks keeping their spears up in the air. Alexander's phalanxes were also deeper than the traditional Greek tactic, with 16 rows of soldiers instead of 8. Alexander would divide his phalanx into divisions of 3,000 men each. Outside of the Phalangites, troops known as Hypapists or shield bearers served as flexible units. While the phalanx was rigid and stayed in formation, the Hypapists would fill the gaps between them so as to avoid flanking, especially on uneven terrain where tight formations were not possible. These troops were able to move out the gaps, however, when needed. These Hypapists would be very similar to earlier hoplites, with bronze cuirasses, shorter dory spears, and larger bronze shields, as well as a short sword. The armor of the shield bearers would change depending on the situation, but going into Gaugamela, it is likely that they were fully armored, only Phrygian helmets differentiating them from the hoplites of earlier years. Other light irregular troops, known as peltasts, were also present. These troops were usually only armored with a helmet, if that, and were more mobile, using javelins, slings, and bows to harass the enemy, as well as pelty shields that were smaller than the heavy infantry, and short swords. Cavalry also featured much more heavily in Alexander's army than the previous Greek armies. Heavy cavalry, which he himself fought in, was fully armored with bronze cuirasses, along with the horse. They also wore Boeotian helmets instead of the taller Phrygian ones, which provided less protection but more visibility and less drag when moving at high speeds. Instead of a sarissa pike, however, they were armed with a spear about 10 feet long called a zeston. The zeston lance was also double-headed, so if one end was broken off in combat, the other side could be used. Heavy cavalry was also armed with javelins for throwing at the enemy, as well as curved machiera swords, which were very effective against infantry, especially from the heightened angle. Light cavalry had less armor, but more mobility and similar armament. Alexander is believed to have entered the battlefield of Gaugamela with 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, likely less than half the size of the Persian forces. Of the 40,000 infantry, 18,000 were phalangites, 6,000 were Hypapists, and the remaining 16,000 were peltasts and other light infantry and ranged fighters. Of the cavalry, 3,000 were heavy, with the other 4,000 being regular or lighter cavalry. The region was a wide open plain in what is now northern Iraq. To the east there was a small river, as well as the village of Gaugamela, and further east the city of Arbela. This is why there are two names for the battle, as Gaugamela was closer, but Arbela was the major city in the area. To the north lay the Kurd Mountains, and the Tigris River lay to the west, then bent eastward in the south. Between the two camps was a rise, which made it so they could not see each other until Alexander crested the hill. The battle itself took place in a very flat, wide open area. In preparation for the battle, Darius had the ground leveled even more, especially in the middle, so that his chariots could move at full speed. This was the engineering project that Alexander saw that made him wait a day to attack. The area was quite dusty, which would make visibility quite bad when the fighting began.
And I'm sort of the top, like the eagle whose feather I was forward, and the helmet that I wore as I swatted my many enemies, shattered them like a porcelain pot.
Finally, on August 1st, 331 BC, the battle would commence. The Persians were arrayed in a very long line, making the most of their large numbers. In the center of the formation was Darius himself, surrounded by his immortals, Greek mercenaries, Indian cavalry, and Mardian archers. On his right were divisions of Medians, Albanians, Parthians, and Mesopotamians, and on his left were the main Persian infantry and cavalry, as well as cavalry units from Bactria. In front of this main line were Scythian and Bactrian divisions of cavalry on the left, along with 100 chariots. 50 chariots as well as the Armenian cavalry were on the right, and the remaining 50 chariots as well as the elephants were in the front of the center. The various nationalities within the Persian groups did not all have the same armor or armament, but nonetheless they fought on the same side and fought under the same command structure. Alexander, with a much smaller force, had to be careful how he arrayed himself, as the wide open plain allowed for Darius to envelop his entire force. To counter this, Alexander had a main line with the wings angled slightly out, as well as a reserve line behind them to counter flankers while maintaining the main attack. In the center of Alexander's main line was the phalanx. On the left was an infantry unit plus 2 units of cavalry. To the right were the Hypapists, followed by Alexander himself and his heavy cavalry and royal guard. In the reserve unit was another division of phalangite troops in the middle, with light infantry, archers, and cavalry on the right and left. In front of the whole group, more towards the right, were archers and other ranged skirmishing troops, and a Thracian element of soldiers was left back to guard the camp. Alexander began his advance by moving to the right so as to avoid getting enveloped, even if he disadvantaged his left wing more. This almost avoided the more leveled ground that Darius had prepared, making it hard for him to use his chariots. To check Alexander's rightward movement and to keep the leveled ground in play, the left wing of Darius's cavalry moved to flank them, but the Macedonian reserve cavalry on the right moved to intercept. At first it was a stalemate, but more cavalry and infantry from the reserve line aided them, and Darius matched them with more cavalry from his main line. Eventually, however, the superior tactics and discipline of the Greek troops on the right began to win out. Darius then sent his chariots to charge the Greek advance guard and phalanx, but the light troops Alexander had arrayed up front largely scattered or stopped them. The few that did make it simply passed through the lines that the Greeks opened up for them and were captured. Darius's main hope against Alexander had been defeated. Even more cavalry was then sent to flank Alexander on his right, but once again they were countered by Alexander's light cavalry reserves, this time being completely flanked themselves and destroyed. However, the Persian cavalry on the main line also moved to aid Darius's attacking cavalry. This proved to be a mistake as it opened up a hole in the line. Seeing this, Alexander charged the right wing and 5 of the 6 phalanx divisions toward the gap. To this day, it is unknown if Alexander had done this on purpose to try and open up the hole, or if it had just been a happy accident. Either way, this was the apex of the battle, and bloody hand-to-hand combat ensued. The Persian troops were taken aback, and Darius himself was in the thick of the worst part of the battle. Allegedly, Alexander saw Darius and threw a javelin at him, but missed. However, Darius's charioteer was later killed. Darius was in a terrible situation, but the rest of the battlefield was much more even. Alexander's reserve cavalry was winning, as was his attack on Darius's center, but Darius's right wing was largely intact and ready to attack Alexander's left. However, the dust that hid the rest of the battle from him, as well as the surrounding chaos, spurred Darius to escape on a horse, further damaging his troops' morale while strengthening the Macedonians. The battle wasn't over yet, however. The Persians still had a right wing, and that right wing cavalry jumped into the battle and flanked the Macedonian left, which would have been encircled completely had it not been for the last brigade of the phalanx that stood by. This left a hole in Alexander's formation, however, and it did not go unnoticed by Persian cavalry in the middle, who charged the gap. Instead of attacking the Macedonian rear, though, the Persian and Indian cavalry made for the Macedonian camp, where they quickly overran the defensive force and began to ransack it. Seeing this, the reserve unit of phalangites went back to the camp and were able to defeat and force the cavalry to retreat. By this point, Alexander's left wing was being overwhelmed by the Persians, and Alexander and the rest of his force began to move to help them after attempting to pursue Darius. But the Persian cavalry that was returning from the Macedonian camp intercepted him and delayed the unification of his forces. Eventually, the Persian cavalry was defeated, but Alexander had lost 60 men out of his personal guard, as well as seeing 3 of his generals wounded. However, the Macedonian left had held its own, and seeing Alexander coming to the aid of the left, the remaining Persian army fled from the field. The disaster for the Persian forces did not end there, however. The massive force attempted to cross a river to reach Arbela, but with only a small bridge crossing it, many of the Persian soldiers were trampled or drowned trying to escape. Alexander had won the day, the Persian armies had scattered and defeated, and Darius was fleeing for his life. While the exact numbers are unknown, it is estimated that around 500 Macedonian soldiers died compared to 40,000 Persians. The next day, Alexander arrived at Arbela, and a few days later he made his way to the city of Babylon, which accepted him as the ruler of the world. Darius had escaped, but his empire was effectively in the hands of Alexander the Great. The next year, Alexander would go on to take the Persian capital of Persepolis, as well as Susa and Pasargada. The same year, Darius would be murdered by his cousin Bessus, who was also a general at Gaugamela. Alexander was upset at this, as he respected Darius as a worthy opponent and was sad to hear that he had been assassinated. Alexander buried Darius in Persepolis, as the other Persian emperors had, and then pursued Bessus and the remaining disloyal Persian elements into Bactria, killing them. Alexander continued to expand northeast to the Caspian Sea, Scythia, and even to the Indus River, where he defeated Indian forces. By 327 BC, Alexander the Great had reached the Ganges and wanted to go further, but was stopped by his troops, who wished to return home after almost a decade away. In just 8 years, Alexander controlled everything from Egypt to India to Persia to Greece, from the Indian Ocean to the Caspian Sea. 3 years later, Alexander would join his adversary Darius when he mysteriously died at the age of 32 in Babylon, the prize of his victory at Gaugamela. Gaugamela was a decisive battle in history in many ways. Firstly is that the odds were strongly against Alexander. He was outmatched as much as 3-1 and faced off against a Persian force on ideal ground that had time to prepare, unlike at Marathon. Additionally, a defeat at Gaugamela wouldn't have just delayed Alexander's conquest, but stopped it entirely. If Alexander had lost, even if it was a small loss, he would have had to retreat, which given the geography would have been impossible, and he would have been captured or killed in the process. This battle would only have gone the way it did with Alexander at the helm, as no one else could have conquered Greece, Egypt, and Persia, or won the pitched battle. The wider impact of Alexander's victory was that he cemented his reign and ushered in the Hellenistic period of history. As we've discussed in earlier videos, the Greeks introduced many foundational ideas to the world, including democracy, philosophy, and lots of science, art, and architecture. If these ideas had only stayed in Greece, however, they would not have come to define the world today. This was only possible through an expansion of Greek ideas into the rest of the world. Rome would end up doing this in the West and Europe, but Alexander would move these ideas to the East as well. Most importantly for Western culture, Hellenism introduced Greek styles of philosophy, including the basic idea of logic, to the Jews, and this affected many writings that exist in the Bible even today. Ideas of the Logos and even teleology that exist in religious intellectual circles today came out of this. The East is also the region that preserved the Greek works during the European Middle Ages, and the reintroduction of these ideas in Europe produced the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Without Alexander's conquest to the Middle East millennia ago, these ideas could have been lost entirely, and the world would be a much different place. You could, however, dissuade this argument somewhat, given that monasteries within Europe also kept a lot of these classical era works, and some people, including the good channel Whatifalthist, even point out that perhaps the Enlightenment and the Renaissance were not actually consequences of the reintroduction of classical thought, but rather they were original outgrowths of what was already happening in Western society. The introduction of these ideas to the rest of the world is still important nonetheless. Creasy makes an additional claim as well, which I'm not sure I believe, but it is interesting nonetheless. Creasy points out that while Arabic and Hindu cultures had lots of their own philosophy and science, the impetus for these advancements was Greek culture, which infused with the local cultures to produce a spirit of exploration and an aim at understanding the world. I do not know the validity of this, but at a cursory look it is plausible. Creasy also points out that the Persian Empire at this time was very weak, and was bound to fall even if Alexander had not defeated Darius. However, he insists that the fact of a Western society taking Persia rather than an Asiatic one was very beneficial for the world, and that had another Eastern power taken Persia, it would have been, quote, unprofitable for mankind. This is obviously kind of Eurocentric, but given that the Greeks introduced so much in the way of science and philosophy, it is possible. That being said, we don't have any way to know what the world would be like without Gaugamela, so we can't know for sure. In short, the Greek culture that undergirds the Western world had to expand in order to be influential outside of the Aegean, and to be preserved for later times. Alexander's expansion of his empire and Greek culture along with it did this. It was so important that it even had its own period of history, the Hellenistic period. These Greek ideas reformed how people thought, from the early Muslims to the Jews, and later the Christians, as well as from the Hindus and Egyptians. The Battle of Gaugamela was not only hugely impactful, but also improbable. This was no Battle of Berlin, where a change in fortune during the fighting would only delay the inevitable. This battle was a turning point in history and tipped the scales in favor of the Greeks over the Asiatics, ensuring that their culture would be the one to reign over much of the world. Eventually, Alexander's empire would fall, and while the ideas would stay, the political clout would not. The Mediterranean didn't have an empire, and that power vacuum would need to be filled. During the Second Punic War a century later, Carthage and Rome would square off to decide who would take up Alexander's mantle as ruler of the world, and the outcome of the whole conflict came down to one, lesser-known battle on the Meteris River. So that's it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching to this point. Next time I'm going to look at the Battle of Meteris in 207 BC. If you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.